What if the most important job in the world was one you couldn't refuse? What if your body wasn't your own, but a vessel for the state? What if your survival and the survival of your kingdom depended on enduring an ordeal in a crowded room with only ignorant doctors to help? For centuries, this was the reality for royal women. History books give us the dates of a prince's birth. They don't tell us what his mother went through to put him there. They don't talk about the fear, the pain, and the overwhelming chance that neither of them would live to see the next day. Number 20. Why was a queen's bedroom a public theater? Marie Antoinette gave birth to her first child in 1778. Nearly 200 people crammed into her bedchamber to watch. Courtiers, ministers, and staff climbed on furniture for a better view. The room was so hot and airless that the queen fainted. The king, Louis XVI, had to break open the sealed windows to revive her. In 1688, Mary of Modena, wife of James II of England, had at least 42 officials witness the birth of her son. This was to prove he was truly hers and not a baby smuggled into the palace in a warming pan. The practice of having an official government witness present at a royal birth in Britain only ended in 1948, just before the birth of the future King Charles III. The idea of giving birth in private is a modern one. For a queen, it was impossible. Childbirth was not a medical event. It was a state event. The single most important function of a queen was to produce a legitimate heir, preferably a male one. And for that heir to be legitimate, his birth had to be verified. The kingdom could not afford any doubt. Rumors of a faked birth could lead to civil war. So the doors were thrown open. Imagine the scene. A woman is in the most vulnerable position of her life. She is in pain, she is exhausted, and she is frightened, but she is not alone with a supportive partner and a trusted doctor. She is the main attraction in a crowded, noisy, and often unsanitary room. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of eyes are on her. They are not there to offer comfort. They are there to scrutinize. They are watching to make sure no trickery occurs. They are waiting for the outcome, a matter of national importance. This public spectacle was a profound source of stress. The pressure on the queen was immense. She had to perform her duty under the gaze of the entire court. The noise and lack of fresh air were physically dangerous. The risk of infection in such a crowded space was enormous. But privacy was a luxury a queen could not afford. The stability of the throne depended on unquestionable proof. This practice was rooted in a deep-seated fear of succession crises. In England, the Wars of the Roses were a recent memory, a bloody conflict sparked by competing claims to the throne. In France, the rules of Salic law meant only a male could inherit, making the birth of a dauphin even more critical. A whispered rumor that the queen had faked a pregnancy or swapped a daughter for a commoner's son could unravel the entire political order. The witnesses were not just random courtiers. They were carefully chosen. They included high-ranking nobles, government ministers, members of the clergy, and ambassadors from foreign powers. Each person there was an official verifier. When the child was born, they would see it with their own eyes. They would hear its first cry. The Archbishop of Canterbury, for example, was a traditional witness in England. The Home Secretary's presence in later centuries was a continuation of this tradition, a symbol of state oversight. The Queen had no say in the matter. It was part of her marital contract, her duty to the crown. Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry V, endured multiple public births. So did Anne of Austria, the mother of Louis XIV of France. Her difficult labor was a public affair, with the court anxiously awaiting the arrival of an heir after 23 years of childless marriage. The shift towards privacy began slowly. It was driven by changing sensibilities and, eventually, by monarchs who had enough power to demand it. Her Queen Victoria was a major force for change. She detested the public nature of childbirth and pregnancy. She insisted on more privacy, and her status as the reigning monarch gave her the authority to enforce her wishes. Still, the tradition of an official witness lingered for decades. It took until the mid-20th century for the practice to be fully abolished, finally recognizing that the birth of a royal baby could be a private family moment, not a public circus. But for centuries, a queen's labor was a performance, and her bedroom was a stage. Number 19 was producing a daughter a complete failure. In 1533, King Henry V of England waited for news from the birthing chamber. He was confident his second wife, Anne Boleyn, would give him the son he desperately needed. He had broken with the Catholic Church and divorced his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, for this moment. When the baby was born, it was healthy, but it was a girl. The future Queen Elizabeth I, Henry's disappointment was so great he canceled the planned jousts and celebrations. The birth of a healthy princess was treated not as a joy, but as a political disaster. Catherine of Aragon had previously given birth to 5 children who did not survive infancy. Only one, a girl named Mary, lived. This failure to produce a son was the official reason for her divorce. A queen's primary value was tied directly to her ability to produce a male heir. In a world governed by male primogeniture, a son was everything. A son could inherit the throne, lead armies, and continue the dynasty. A daughter could not, in most cases. A daughter was a political tool of a different kind. She was a bargaining chip, a bride to be married off to a foreign prince to secure an alliance. Her value was in whom she could marry, not in what she could rule. The pressure on a queen to have a son began the moment she was married. From her wedding day, the court and the entire country watched and waited. Her monthly cycles were a matter of public speculation. A missed period was a cause for national hope. The arrival of her period was a moment of collective disappointment. This constant scrutiny was a heavy psychological burden. When a queen became pregnant, the prayers were all for a boy. Astrologers were consulted. Superstitious rituals were performed. The gender of the unborn child was the subject of endless gossip and political calculation. If she gave birth to a daughter, it was seen as her personal failure. The king might be disappointed, the court might be dismissive, and the queen's own position could be weakened. This failure had dire consequences. For Catherine of Aragon, her inability to provide a living son led to her repudiation and a religious schism that changed the course of English history. For Anne Boleyn, producing only a daughter and then failing to carry a son to term contributed directly to her downfall and execution. Her enemies used her failure to produce an heir as evidence that her marriage was not blessed by God. Even when a daughter was welcomed, there was always an undercurrent of better luck next time. When the future Queen Victoria was born in 1819, her father, the Duke of Kent, was pleased. But the general feeling in the country was one of mild disappointment. The direct line of succession was fragile, and a boy would have made it more secure. The Queen's own feelings were often overlooked. She might love her daughter dearly, but she knew that in the eyes of the state, she had not yet fulfilled her primary function. She was expected to get pregnant again as soon as possible and try again for a boy. This led to a relentless cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing, or handing the baby over to a wet nurse to speed up the process of conceiving again. The physical toll of this constant childbearing was immense. The birth of a daughter could also create political instability. If a king had only daughters, it could lead to disputes over the succession. Could a woman rule in her own right? In some countries, like England, it was possible but controversial. In others, like France with its Salic law, it was forbidden. This meant a king with only daughters would see his throne pass to a more distant male relative, a cousin or a nephew, potentially sparking conflict. The birth of a girl was therefore not just a family matter, but a potential threat to the peace and security of the realm. The pressure was not just to have a child, but to have a child of the correct gender. For a queen, anything less was a public failure. Number 18. Why did queens face a lifetime of pregnancy? Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, had 10 children. Empress Maria Theresa of Austria had 16 children in just under 20 years. Queen Charlotte, the wife of King George III of the United Kingdom, gave birth to 15 children. These were not exceptions. For a royal woman, life was often an endless cycle of pregnancy and childbirth. Her duty did not end with the birth of one son. A single heir was not enough. The reason was simple and brutal: infant mortality was astoundingly high. A healthy prince could be taken by illness in a matter of days. Smallpox, measles, or even a simple fever could be a death sentence. In the 18th century, it's estimated that nearly half of all children did not live to the age of 5. Royal children were not immune. In fact, their cloistered lives could sometimes make them more vulnerable, as they had not been exposed to a range of common illnesses to build up immunity. King Edward I of England and his wife Eleanor of Castile had at least 14 children. Only 6 survived to adulthood. Queen Anne of Great Britain endured a heartbreaking 17 pregnancies. Most were miscarriages or stillbirths. Only one child, Prince William, survived infancy, but he died at the age of 11. Her personal tragedy became a national succession crisis. Because of this constant threat, a king needed an heir and a spare. And a spare for the spare. A dynasty was only secure if it had multiple healthy sons. This meant the queen was expected to remain fertile and productive for her entire childbearing life. As soon as she had recovered from one birth, the pressure was on to conceive again. This had a devastating effect on a woman's health. Frequent pregnancies depleted the body of essential nutrients like calcium and iron. Each birth carried the risk of death from hemorrhage, infection, or exhaustion. The cumulative physical damage was immense. Many queens suffered from chronic health problems as a result of their many pregnancies. Their bodies were, in essence, sacrificed for the security of the state. The use of wet nurses was a key part of this system. Queens rarely breastfed their own children. This wasn't because they were uncaring mothers, it was a political calculation. Breastfeeding naturally suppresses ovulation and can delay the return of fertility. To get the queen pregnant again as quickly as possible, the baby was handed over to a wet nurse immediately after birth. This cut the time between pregnancies, maximizing the number of potential heirs she could produce. The queen's life became a public record of fertility. The court calendar revolved around her pregnancies. A successful birth was celebrated. A miscarriage was a state setback. Her personal health and well-being were secondary to her reproductive function. Consider the case of Maria Theresa of Austria. Her 16 pregnancies were a deliberate political strategy. She was solidifying the Habsburg dynasty, providing children to be married into other royal houses across Europe, creating a network of alliances. She famously advised her daughter, Marie Antoinette, to produce children for the French throne with urgency. Her life was a testament to the idea of the royal womb as an instrument of state policy. This relentless pressure also meant there was no concept of a break. A queen could not decide she was done having children after 2 or 3. The decision was not hers to make. It was her husband's and his ministers. As long as she was physically capable of conceiving, she was expected to continue. This continued until she either reached menopause or died. For many royal women, their childbearing years were a period of constant physical discomfort, anxiety, and the ever-present risk of death. It was a life sentence of pregnancy, all in the name of the crown. Number 17 was a royal baby, even raised by its mother. Immediately after George IV of the United Kingdom was born in 1762, he was taken from his mother, Queen Charlotte, and handed over to a wet nurse. The queen would see her son, but she would not be his primary caregiver. She would not feed him, and she would not spend her days tending to his needs. This was the standard practice. A royal baby was the property of the state, and its upbringing was far too important to be left to the mother alone. The most immediate reason for this separation was, as mentioned, political. The queen needed to get pregnant again. Breastfeeding would delay this, so a wet nurse, a woman who had recently given birth herself, was hired to feed the royal infant. The selection of a wet nurse was a serious business. She had to be in perfect health. Her own family background and moral character were scrutinized. Her diet was strictly controlled, as it was believed that her milk transmitted not just nutrients, but also aspects of her personality and social standing. A peasant woman's milk might be considered too coarse for a future king. Therefore, the wet nurse was often a woman from the lower gentry. Once chosen, the wet nurse often moved into the palace, sometimes leaving her own baby behind to be fed by another woman or on animal milk. Her role was vital, and she could become a beloved figure in the royal child's life. But her presence created a distance between the queen and her child from the very first days of life. Beyond the wet nurse, the royal nursery was a highly structured institution. It was run by a team of governesses, tutors, and servants. The queen was the head of the household, but She was not involved in the day-to-day, hands-on care of her children. A royal child's life was scheduled and regimented. There were set times for lessons, for meals, for prayer, and for play. The queen might visit the nursery at a designated time each day, a formal appointment rather than a spontaneous act of motherly affection. This system was not necessarily born of coldness. It was a product of the belief that raising a future monarch was a specialized job. A queen had her own duties attending court, engaging in diplomacy, and managing her vast household. The child's education and development were delegated to a team of experts. The goal was to mold a prince or princess, not just to raise a child. The emotional impact of this separation is hard to gauge from historical records. Some queens, like Queen Victoria, expressed frustration with the formality of it all. While she did not personally care for her 9 children as infants, she took a keen interest in their upbringing and wrote detailed instructions for their governesses. She also famously hated pregnancy and found newborns to be ugly, which may have made the distance easier for her. Other queens may have felt a deep sense of loss. To carry a child for 9 months, endure a difficult birth, and then have that child immediately handed over to another woman must have been a painful experience for many. But it was the expected way of things. To insist on breastfeeding or personally caring for her infant would have been seen as eccentric and a dereliction of her primary duty to produce more heirs. This distance often continued as the children grew. Royal children were often sent to live in their own separate households, away from their parents, for years at a time. This was done for their safety, to keep them away from the political intrigues and diseases of the court, and to oversee their education without distraction. The future Louis XIV of France barely saw his mother, Anne of Austria, during his early years. The result was that the relationship between a royal mother and her child was often formal and distant. They may have loved each other, but they did not have the close, daily intimacy that is common today. A prince's first loyalty was to the crown, and his upbringing reflected that. He was a future king first, and a son second. The mother who bore him was the queen, a figure of state, and not the woman who rocked him to sleep or nursed him through a fever. That role belonged to a staff of near strangers. Number 16, what was the lying in? For up to a month before her due date, a royal woman would enter a period of confinement known as the lying in. This was not a quiet rest period, it was a highly ritualized and often isolating ordeal. The queen would withdraw from public life and enter a specially prepared suite of rooms. The windows were sealed shut or covered with heavy tapestries. Light was blocked out. Fresh air was forbidden. The only light came from candles, or a carefully tended fire, regardless of the season. The purpose of this ritual was twofold. First, it was based on the medical theories of the time, which held that a pregnant woman was in a delicate, almost mystical state. It was believed that a sudden shock, a strong smell, or even a draft of cold air could harm the unborn child, cause a miscarriage, or result in a monstrous birth. The outside world was seen as a source of danger. The sealed, dark, and stuffy room was meant to be a protective womb for the womb. Second, the lying in was a deeply religious period. The birthing chamber was transformed into a temporary chapel. Religious relics, crucifixes, and images of saints associated with childbirth, like Saint Margaret, were brought into the room. The queen was attended by her ladies-in-waiting and midwives. Men, including doctors until later centuries, were strictly forbidden. The atmosphere was one of quiet, prayerful anticipation. It was a time for the queen to prepare her soul for the life-threatening ordeal to come. And childbirth was so dangerous that it was treated as a preparation for a potential death. The queen might confess her sins and receive communion. This period of isolation could last for 4 to 6 weeks. After the birth, if both mother and child survived, the confinement continued. The queen was not allowed to leave her chambers until she was deemed fully recovered and ready for her churching ceremony. This was a religious service of purification and thanksgiving, which officially welcomed her back into society. While intended to be protective, the lying-in period was often detrimental to the queen's health. The lack of fresh air and sunlight was depressing and unhealthy. The sealed rooms became breeding grounds for bacteria. The environment was stifling and claustrophobic. For a woman already anxious about the upcoming birth, this forced isolation in a dark, overheated room could be a form of psychological torment. The lying in of Elizabeth of York, wife of King Henry VII and mother of Henry V, is well documented. Before the birth of her first son, Prince Arthur, she entered her lying-in chamber at Winchester. The room was hung with rich tapestries, and every crack and crevice was sealed to keep out the air. She remained there for weeks, surrounded only by her female attendants. The practice also emphasized the separation of the queen from the normal world. She was a vessel for the heir, and her body was a state concern that needed to be managed and controlled. She lost all personal freedom during this time. Her diet, her activities, and her companions were all dictated by tradition and medical superstition. As medical knowledge slowly advanced, the customs of the lying-in began to change. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the extreme sealing of the rooms was less common, though a period of quiet withdrawal from public life before and after the birth remained the norm. Queen Victoria, for example, would retreat to her private apartments for her confinements, but she did not endure the medieval-style darkness and lack of air. The tradition, however, left a long legacy. It reinforced the idea that pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous, mysterious processes that set a woman apart from society, a period of vulnerability where her life hung in the balance. Number 15. How did superstition control the birthing room? A difficult labor was not just a medical problem. It was a sign of divine displeasure. A queen suffering through a prolonged and painful birth might be accused of sin, witchcraft, or adultery. In 1536, Anne Boleyn miscarried a male fetus. This was interpreted by her enemies and perhaps even by her husband Henry V as God's judgment on their marriage. It was a key piece of evidence used to justify her execution just a few months later. The birthing chamber was not a place of science. It was a battleground of faith, fear, and superstition. Every aspect of a royal birth was steeped in ritual and belief. The room itself was cleansed of malevolent spirits. The queen might wear special amulets or girdles inscribed with prayers. One famous example was a girdle made from the tooth of Saint Apollonia, believed to ease pain. Another was the Girdle of Our Lady, a relic that was loaned out to laboring queens in England for centuries. Astrology played a huge role. Court astrologers would cast horoscopes to determine the most auspicious time for the birth. The position of the planets and stars at the moment of the child's birth was believed to determine its entire life and destiny. A birth at an unlucky time could be seen as a terrible omen for the kingdom. The line between medicine and magic was blurry. Remedies given to the queen were a mix of herbal concoctions and pure superstition. A popular tonic in the Middle Ages to speed up labor was a drink made from eagle's dung mixed with wine. Other cures involved tying a piece of red cloth around the thigh or placing a magnet in the queen's hand. These practices were based on ancient beliefs about the body and the natural world, not on any scientific understanding of childbirth. The fear of a monstrous birth was pervasive. A child born with any kind of physical deformity was not seen as a medical issue. It was a divine message, a sign of God's anger, or the devil's influence. It could be blamed on the queen's sinful thoughts, a fright she received during pregnancy, or even witchcraft practiced against the royal family. A monstrous birth could have serious political consequences, casting doubt on the legitimacy of the dynasty. The private tragedy of a family was interpreted as a public portent of doom. The attendants in the birthing chamber were part of this world of belief. For centuries, childbirth was an exclusively female domain. Midwives were the experts. Their knowledge was passed down through generations, a combination of practical experience and traditional folklore. They knew how to turn a baby in the womb and how to manage a difficult birth, but their methods were often intertwined with superstitious rituals. They might recite charms or place symbolic objects under the birthing bed. When male physicians began to enter the birthing chamber in the 17th and 18th centuries, it created a clash of cultures. These men often dismissed the midwife's traditional knowledge as ignorant superstition. However, their own scientific methods were often just as dangerous, if not more so. They brought with them a belief in aggressive intervention, which often did more harm than good. Even the baby's layout was subject to superstition. Certain colors were considered lucky. The swaddling clothes might have protective symbols embroidered on them. The cradle would be blessed. Every precaution was taken to protect the precious new life from unseen forces. This reliance on superstition highlights the profound sense of helplessness that surrounded childbirth. With no real understanding of the biological processes and with death a constant possibility, people turned to the supernatural for a sense of control. For a queen whose birth was a matter of state, this pressure was magnified. A successful, easy birth of a healthy son was a sign of God's favor on the kingdom. A difficult labor, a stillbirth, or a daughter was a sign that something was deeply wrong, not just with her body, but with the spiritual health of the entire nation. Number 14, what was childbed fever? Princess Charlotte of Wales, the only child of the future King George IV, died in 1817. She was 21 and the hope of the nation. After a grueling labor of over 50 hours, she gave birth to a stillborn son. A few hours later, she began to complain of chills and abdominal pain. She died shortly after. In 1847, the wife of a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis also died from similar symptoms after a minor procedure. The cause of death for both women was the same puerperal fever, or childbed fever. It was the single greatest killer of women after childbirth for centuries. It killed rich and poor, commoners and queens alike, and it was caused by the doctors themselves. Childbed fever was a bacterial infection of the uterus, usually streptococcus, introduced into the mother's body during or after childbirth. Today, we know it can be prevented with basic hygiene, but for centuries its cause was a mystery. It was blamed on everything from a buildup of bad humors and stagnant milk to cold air or emotional distress. The real cause was filth. In the 19th century, a new kind of medical professional was on the rise, the male physician accoucheur, or obstetrician. These men often came to the birthing chamber directly from performing autopsies or treating patients with infectious diseases. They did not wash their hands. They did not change their clothes. The very concept of germs did not yet exist. A doctor's blood-stained coat was seen as a badge of honor, a sign of his experience. These doctors would then perform internal examinations on the laboring queen, unknowingly transmitting deadly bacteria from a corpse or a sick patient directly into her body. The results were devastating. Epidemics of childbed fever swept through hospitals, killing up to 30% of women who gave birth there. Royal women, attended by the most famous and sought-after doctors, were at just as much risk. The story of Ignaz Semmelweis is a tragic chapter in this history. While working at a Vienna hospital, he noticed a stark difference in death rates between two maternity wards. One was run by doctors and medical students, the other by midwives. The death rate in the doctor's ward was 5 times higher. Semmelweis observed that the doctors were coming directly from the autopsy room to the delivery room. The midwives were not. He hypothesized that the doctors were carrying cadaverous particles on their hands. He instituted a simple policy: all doctors had to wash their hands in a chlorine solution before examining a patient. The death rate plummeted by 90%. It was a medical miracle. But Semmelweis's discovery was not celebrated. It was rejected and ridiculed by the medical establishment. The idea that esteemed gentlemen doctors could be the cause of death was an insult. It was easier to blame the victims. Semmelweis was hounded out of his profession and died in a mental institution, ironically from an infected wound. It would be decades before his ideas and the germ theory of Louis Pasteur were widely accepted. Countless women, including royal and noble ladies, died because of this medical arrogance and ignorance. Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VI, is a likely victim. She gave birth to the long-awaited male heir, the future Edward VI, in 1537. The birth was long and difficult. She developed a fever a few days later and died. The official cause was natural causes, but the symptoms are consistent with childbed fever. The introduction of forceps and other instruments, while sometimes life-saving, also increased the risk of infection. Unsterilized metal tools could introduce bacteria deep into the body. The combination of internal injuries from a difficult birth and the introduction of germs was a lethal cocktail. For centuries, a woman who survived the labor itself still faced the terrifying prospect of a fever that could claim her life in the days that followed, a danger brought to her bedside by the very men who were supposed to be helping her. Number 13, what happened if the baby was born with a disability? When the future Queen Mary I of England was a child, a courtier observed her and noted a slight deformity in one of her shoulders. This minor physical imperfection was a source of great anxiety and was commented upon in diplomatic reports. In an age that viewed royalty as divinely appointed, physical perfection was seen as a reflection of inner virtue and legitimacy. A baby born with a significant disability was not just a family tragedy, it was a potential dynastic crisis and a theological problem. This was known as a monstrous birth. The term monster did not necessarily mean something frightening, but rather something that was a sign or an omen, a deviation from the natural order. A child born with a condition like a cleft palate, a clubfoot, or Down syndrome was seen as a message from God. It was often interpreted as a punishment for the sins of the parents or the kingdom. The blame almost always fell on the queen. It was believed that the mother's state of mind during pregnancy could physically shape the child. If a queen was frightened by an animal, her child might be born with a hairy patch. If she had sinful or unchaste thoughts, the child might be born deformed as a sign of her moral corruption. This placed an incredible burden on the queen to maintain a perfect, placid demeanor throughout her pregnancy. The birth of a disabled child could be used as a political weapon. It could be used to argue that the king's marriage was cursed or that the dynasty had lost divine favor. The child itself was often hidden away. Its existence might be concealed from the public to avoid political fallout. The child might be sent to a remote estate or a monastery, out of sight and out of the line of succession. One of the most famous and tragic cases is that of the children of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra of Russia. Their only son, Alexei, was born with hemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. This was passed down through Alexandra's side of the family, originating with her grandmother, Queen Victoria. Alexei's condition was a state secret. His every move was monitored to prevent the slightest bump or cut, which could lead to a life-threatening bleed. The desperate search for a cure for Alexei led the Empress to fall under the influence of the mystic Rasputin, who seemed to be the only one who could ease the boy's suffering. This reliance on Rasputin had disastrous political consequences, undermining the authority of the Tsar and contributing to the eventual collapse of the Russian Empire. Alexei's hidden disability had a direct impact on the course of history. In earlier centuries, the fate of a disabled royal child could be even more grim. While infanticide was a sin, a severely disabled infant might be allowed to die through neglect. The pressure to produce a perfect heir was so intense that a child who did not meet that standard was seen as a failure that needed to be erased. Even if the child survived, their life was one of exclusion. They would be passed over in the succession in favor of a younger, able-bodied sibling. They would not be offered the same educational opportunities or be considered for a strategic marriage. Their disability was a permanent mark of shame on the family. This fear of monstrous birth was connected to the broader superstitions of the time. It was a world that looked for signs and symbols in everything. A comet in the sky, a failed harvest, or the birth of a disabled prince were all seen as part of the same cosmic conversation. For a royal family whose legitimacy rested on the idea of a divinely ordained bloodline, a child who deviated from the physical norm was a terrifying threat to that order. Number 12. How did male doctors make childbirth more dangerous? For most of history, childbirth was a woman's world. Midwives, with their practical, hands-on experience passed down through generations, were the undisputed experts. But starting in the 17th century, a new figure began to appear in the royal birthing chamber, the male man midwife, or accoucheur. Their arrival was a status symbol. Having a fashionable university-educated doctor attend a birth showed that a family was modern and wealthy. But these men often brought with them an arrogance and a set of dangerous theories that made them more of a liability than a help. One of the biggest problems was their lack of practical experience. Midwives had attended hundreds of births. They knew the process intimately. Doctors, on the other hand, had book knowledge. Their understanding was often based on dissecting corpses, not on assisting living, breathing women. They viewed childbirth as a mechanical process that often needed correction. This led to a culture of intervention, where a midwife might counsel patients and support the natural process of labor. A doctor was more likely to want to manage the birth. This meant a greater readiness to use instruments. The invention of the obstetrical forceps in the 17th century, a secret held by the Chamberlain family for generations, was a major turning point. In skilled hands, forceps could save a baby's life in a case of obstructed labor, but in unskilled hands, they could cause horrific injuries to both mother and child, including tearing, fistulas, and skull fractures. Male doctors also faced a significant handicap because of social propriety. It was considered improper for a man to look at or touch a woman's private parts. Therefore, a doctor would often have to perform examinations or deliver the baby by feel, working under a sheet or with his back to the patient. This blind approach made it incredibly difficult to assess the situation accurately and increased the risk of causing injury. A midwife, by contrast, had no such restrictions. The medical theories of the time were also actively harmful. Bloodletting was a common treatment for a whole host of ailments, and it was often applied to pregnant or laboring women. A woman suffering from a difficult labor might be bled to calm her system, weakening her at the very moment she needed all her strength. The story of Princess Charlotte of Wales is a tragic example of this mismanagement. Her two doctors, Sir Richard Croft and John Sims, were the most respected in the land. But their approach was disastrous. They bled her repeatedly during her pregnancy. They restricted her diet, leaving her weak. During her 50-hour labor, they refused to intervene with forceps, possibly because they feared causing injury and damaging their reputations. Their decision to let her labor to the point of complete exhaustion likely led to the death of the baby and contributed to her own death from postpartum hemorrhage. After her death, Sir Richard Croft, consumed by guilt and public blame, took his own life. The rise of the male doctor also sidelined the valuable knowledge of midwives. These women were increasingly portrayed as uneducated, superstitious, and dangerous. While some were, many were highly skilled practitioners. But they were pushed out of the birthing rooms of the elite in favor of men with university degrees who often knew far less about the practical realities of birth. This shift represented a loss of traditional female knowledge and a move towards a more medicalized, interventionist, and often more dangerous model of childbirth. Number 11. What were the instruments of the birthing room? The crotchet was a sharp hook. It was used as a last resort in an obstructed labor when the baby could not be delivered and was presumed dead. The instrument was used to dismember the fetus in the womb so it could be extracted in pieces, saving the mother's life. The vectus was a single, spoon-shaped blade used to try and lever the baby's head out of the birth canal. It was often ineffective and could easily slip, causing severe damage. These were the brutal tools of childbirth before modern surgery. They represented a desperate choice between almost certain death for both mother and child and a slim chance of survival for the mother alone. For most of history, if a baby became stuck in the birth canal, there was very little anyone could do. The mother and child would endure a prolonged, agonizing labor that would end in their deaths. The invention of obstetrical instruments was an attempt to solve this deadly problem. The most famous of these instruments is the forceps, developed by the Chamberlain family of Huguenot surgeons in the early 17th century. They were a revolutionary invention. The forceps consisted of two separate curved blades that could be inserted into the birth canal one at a time, locked together around the baby's head, and used to gently pull the baby out. The Chamberlains kept their invention a family secret for over 100 years, arriving at births with their tools hidden in a gilded box and working under a sheet to maintain their monopoly. When the design of forceps finally became public in the 18th century, it changed obstetrics forever. In the right hands, they could prevent a mother's death from exhaustion and save a baby from death by asphyxiation. However, they were also incredibly dangerous. Early versions were crude. There was no standardized training in their use. A clumsy or inexperienced doctor could crush the baby's skull or cause devastating internal tearing to the mother. This could lead to a vesicovaginal fistula, a tear between the bladder and the vagina that resulted in constant, uncontrollable leakage of urine. This was a catastrophic injury that left a woman a social outcast for the rest of her life. The other major surgical intervention was the symphysiotomy. This was a procedure where the cartilage of the pubic bone was cut to widen the pelvis and allow the baby to pass through. It was an excruciatingly painful operation performed without anesthesia. It could lead to permanent disability, leaving the woman unable to walk properly. Before the 19th century and the development of safe anesthesia and antiseptic surgery, the cesarean section was almost exclusively a post-mortem procedure. It was performed on a mother who had already died in labor in a desperate attempt to save the child, or for religious reasons, to ensure the baby could be baptized. Performing a C-section on a living woman was considered a death sentence. The risk of hemorrhage and infection was so high that survival was almost unheard of. It was only in the late 19th century, with the advent of sterilization and better surgical techniques, that the C-section became a viable way to save both mother and child. These instruments and procedures highlight the horrific choices that doctors and families faced. They were born of desperation. The sounds of the birthing chamber were not just of a mother's pain in labor, but sometimes of the brutal, metallic reality of surgical intervention in the most primitive of conditions. For a queen, the failure of her body to perform its function could lead to a terrifying encounter with the sharp and unforgiving tools of early obstetrics. Number 10. Why was pain believed to be a woman's destiny? In the book of Genesis, after Eve eats the forbidden fruit, God's punishment is explicit. I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children. For centuries, this biblical passage was interpreted literally. The agony of childbirth was not just a biological process, it was a divine punishment, a moral and religious necessity. To interfere with it was to go against the will of God. This belief was a major obstacle to the development and acceptance of any form of pain relief in childbirth. When Scottish doctor James Young Simpson began experimenting with chloroform as an anesthetic in the 1840s, he faced a storm of criticism. The clergy in particular were outraged. They argued that pain was a necessary part of the human experience, and that to eliminate the pain of childbirth was to subvert a sacred biblical ordinance. Some doctors also argued that the pain of contractions was a necessary part of labor, helping to expel the baby. They feared that eliminating pain would stop the labor process altogether. The debate was fierce. Proponents argued that it was cruel and unnecessary to allow women to suffer when a safe alternative existed. They pointed out that God had also put Adam into a deep sleep before creating Eve from his rib, suggesting that anesthesia was not, in fact, unchristian. The turning point came from the highest level of society. Queen Victoria, who had already endured 7 difficult births, despised the experience. She called it the shadow side of her life. When she became pregnant with her 8th child, Prince Leopold, in 1853, she decided she wanted to try the controversial new method of pain relief. She asked her physician, Dr. John Snow, to administer chloroform to her during the birth. The event was a sensation. The Queen described the effect as soothing, quieting, and delightful beyond measure. Her endorsement was the single most powerful boost the cause of anesthesia could have received. If it was good enough for the Queen, the head of the Church of England, then it could not be immoral. The practice quickly became fashionable among the upper and middle classes. It was dubbed chloroform à la reine. However, access to this new technology was limited. Chloroform and ether were potent drugs that required a skilled administrator. For most of the 19th century, pain relief remained a luxury for the wealthy. The vast majority of women, especially the poor, continued to give birth without any medical help for their pain. They relied on traditional methods like alcohol, herbal remedies, or simply enduring it through prayer and willpower. The Queen's use of chloroform did not end the debate entirely, but it shifted the ground permanently. It medicalized the pain of childbirth, moving it from the realm of theology to the realm of medicine. It established the idea that a woman did not have to suffer to fulfill her biological destiny. Before this shift, the endurance of pain was seen as a measure of a woman's strength and piety. A woman who complained too much might be seen as weak or sinful. She was expected to bear her suffering with fortitude. The entire culture surrounding childbirth was one of solemn, prayerful endurance of a necessary God-given trial. Queen Victoria, by demanding comfort, helped to change that culture forever, paving the way for the modern expectation that the pain of childbirth can and should be managed. Number 9. What happened to a queen who couldn't have children? A royal marriage was not a love match. It was a contract. The terms of that contract were an alliance between two nations and, most importantly, the production of an heir. A queen who failed to conceive or carry a child to term was in breach of that contract. A barren queen was a political liability, and her position, her marriage, and sometimes her very life were in jeopardy. The blame for infertility was placed squarely on the woman. It was assumed to be her failure, her physical or spiritual flaw. A king's inability to father a child was rarely considered. The pressure on a new queen to conceive was immediate and intense. Her entire worth at court was tied to the state of her womb. Catherine of Aragon is the most famous example. For over 20 years, she was a devoted wife to Henry V and a popular queen of England. But she was able to produce only one living child, a daughter, Mary. Her repeated miscarriages and stillbirths of sons created a succession crisis. Henry became convinced that his marriage was cursed by God because he had married his brother's widow. Her infertility was the official reason for his quest for a divorce, a quest that led him to break with the Catholic Church and found the Church of England. Catherine was cast aside, stripped of her title, and separated from her daughter, all because her body had failed to produce a male heir. Josephine de Beauharnais, the first wife of Napoleon Bonaparte, faced a similar fate. Napoleon was deeply in love with her, but as she aged, it became clear she could not provide him with the son he needed to establish a dynasty. Despite his personal feelings, he made the cold political decision to divorce her. He needed an heir, and she could not give him one. He went on to marry the young Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, who quickly gave birth to a son. Josephine's story shows that even a great love could not protect a queen from the consequences of barrenness. The options for a king with a barren wife were limited and drastic. Divorce was often difficult, especially in Catholic countries where marriage was a sacrament for life. It required a special dispensation from the Pope, which was not always granted, as Henry V discovered. If divorce was not an option, a king might take a mistress in the hopes of producing an illegitimate son, whom he might then try to legitimize. This was a messy and often unsuccessful solution that could lead to competing claims to the throne. In the most extreme cases, a queen could be accused of a crime to get her out of the way. Anne Boleyn's failure to produce a son after the birth of Elizabeth made her vulnerable. When she miscarried a son, her fate was sealed. She was accused of treason and adultery, charges that were almost certainly fabricated, and was executed. Her real crime in the eyes of the king was her failure to fulfill her primary duty. A childless queen lived a life of precariousness and anxiety. She was subject to endless prayers, pilgrimages, and bizarre medical treatments to try and cure her barrenness. She lived with the constant fear of being replaced. Her position at court was weak, and she was often the target of political intrigue. Without a child, especially a son, to secure her place, she was disposable. Her personal tragedy was a political crisis, and her body was the failing centerpiece of it all. Number 8, how did a queen's diet and science harm her? Before the birth of her daughter in 1817, Princess Charlotte of Wales was placed on a strict diet. Her doctors believed that a small baby would be easier to deliver, so they restricted her food intake, hoping to keep the baby's size down. They also bled her regularly. The result was that the princess entered her 50-hour labor in a state of weakness and malnutrition. This medical care likely contributed to her death and the death of her baby. This was not an isolated case. For centuries, the medical advice given to royal women was often based on flawed theories that did more harm than good. The dominant medical theory for over 1,000 years was that of the four humors blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And health was a state of balance between these four fluids. Illness, including the challenges of pregnancy and childbirth, was seen as an imbalance. The treatments were designed to restore that balance. Bloodletting was the most common treatment. A pregnant queen suffering from headaches or swelling would be having a vein opened to drain blood. This was thought to relieve excess humors. In reality, it caused anemia and weakness, making the woman less able to withstand the rigors of childbirth or to fight off infection. The diet of a pregnant queen was also heavily controlled based on these theories. Foods were classified as hot, cold, wet, or dry. A pregnant woman was considered to be in a hot and wet state, so she would be advised to eat cold and dry foods to maintain balance. This could lead to a diet lacking in essential nutrients. The idea of specific nutritional needs during pregnancy, such as the need for iron and folic acid, was completely unknown. A queen might be well fed in terms of quantity, but poorly nourished in terms of quality. Another dangerous belief was the idea of maternal impression. This was the theory that a mother's thoughts and experiences could directly imprint on the fetus. If a pregnant woman was frightened by a rabbit, it was believed her child could be born with a hair lip. This led to queens being shielded from any unpleasant sights or news. While this might have reduced stress, it also led to a culture of blame. If a child was born with a birth defect, it was the mother's fault for having the wrong thoughts or experiences. After the birth, the advice could be just as strange. It was widely believed that a new mother's first milk, the colostrum, was unhealthy or even poisonous. Royal babies were often not put to the breast for the first few days, being fed honey or sugar water instead. This deprived them of the vital antibodies and nutrients contained in colostrum, increasing their risk of illness. The advice on exercise was also contradictory. Some doctors advised complete rest, leading to muscle weakness and poor circulation. Others recommended gentle exercise, which was more beneficial, but strenuous activity was forbidden. A queen would not have been allowed to continue with activities like riding once her pregnancy was confirmed. These practices were not malicious. They were the best science of their day. The most renowned physicians in Europe advised queens based on these theories. But because the theories themselves were fundamentally wrong, the advice was often counterproductive or actively dangerous. A queen had access to the most expensive medical care available, but that care was based on superstition and incorrect assumptions about the human body. In many cases, a peasant woman who was left alone to follow her own instincts may have been better off. Number 7 was postpartum depression, a royal failing. Empress Carlota of Mexico, wife of Maximilian I, had a series of devastating stillbirths. After these traumatic events, she descended into a deep depression, marked by paranoia and delusion that lasted for the rest of her life. Queen Victoria, after the birth of each of her 9 children, experienced what she described as a deep sadness and a feeling of being not myself. She wrote of her struggles with low spirits and irritability. In their time, these experiences were not understood as a medical condition. They were seen as a sign of spiritual weakness, a lack of gratitude, or a failure of character. There was no concept of postpartum depression or other perinatal mood disorders. The hormonal shifts and psychological trauma that can follow childbirth were not recognized. A queen was expected to be joyful. She had done her duty, produced an heir, and secured the dynasty. To be sad or anxious was considered unnatural and ungrateful. A queen suffering from what we would now identify as postpartum depression would have been completely isolated in her struggle. She would not have received sympathy or medical treatment. Instead, she would have been told to pray more, to be more thankful, or to simply pull herself together. Her feelings would have been dismissed as a case of hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for any unexplained female emotional or physical symptom. The word itself comes from the Greek word for uterus, hystera, reflecting the ancient belief that a woman's emotional instability originated in her womb. The treatment for such hysteria would have been unhelpful at best. It might involve rest cures, where the woman was confined to her bed for weeks, forbidden from reading or socializing. Or it could involve hydrotherapy or other strange treatments. None of these addressed the root cause of her distress. This lack of understanding created a huge burden for royal women. On top of recovering from the physical ordeal of childbirth, they had to maintain a facade of maternal bliss. To admit to feelings of sadness, anxiety, or an inability to bond with the baby would have been to admit to a personal failing. The political environment of the court would have made this even more difficult. Any sign of mental instability in a queen could be used against her by her enemies. It could be used to argue that she was unfit to be a mother or to have any influence over her children's upbringing. It could even be used to question her husband's judgment in marrying her. The experience of Queen Victoria is telling. She was a powerful reigning monarch, yet even she felt the need to hide her struggles. Her private letters and journals reveal a woman who found the postpartum period incredibly difficult. Her husband, Prince Albert, was often frustrated by her moods, not understanding that they were a recurring consequence of her pregnancies. For women in less secure positions like Empress Carlotta, the consequences could be catastrophic. Her mental health collapse, triggered by her traumatic childbirth experiences and the political failure of the Mexican Empire, led to her being declared insane. She spent the last 60 years of her life in seclusion in a castle in Belgium, a prisoner of her own mind and her family's need to hide her away. The harsh realities of royal childbirth were not just physical. The psychological toll, unacknowledged and untreated, could be just as devastating. Number 6. Who were the midwives and why were they feared? For centuries, the person with the most power in the birthing chamber was not the queen or a doctor, but the midwife. These women were the undisputed experts on childbirth. Their knowledge was practical, built on experience from attending hundreds or even thousands of births. They knew how to handle a breech birth, how to manage a long labor, and what herbs might ease pain or stop a hemorrhage. A skilled royal midwife was a respected and well-paid professional. But this power also made them figures of suspicion and fear. Because they held the life of the queen and the heir in their hands, midwives were subject to intense scrutiny. A successful birth brought rewards. A death could bring ruinous accusations. If a royal baby died or was born with a disability, the midwife was an easy scapegoat. She could be accused of incompetence or worse, of witchcraft. The connection between midwives and witchcraft was a persistent one, especially during the great witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. Midwives worked in a world of women, blood, and pain, a world that was mysterious and frightening to the male-dominated religious and legal authorities. They used herbal remedies and traditional charms that could easily be misinterpreted as sorcery. They had knowledge of the female body that few others possessed. Furthermore, a midwife could be accused of malicious acts against the infant. It was believed that a witch midwife might harm the baby in the womb, dedicate it to the devil, or kill it at birth to use its body parts in magical rituals. These were lurid and terrifying accusations, and they led to the persecution and execution of many innocent women. To counter this threat, royal midwives were often required to swear a solemn oath. An English midwife's oath from the 16th century required her to swear that she would not use any witchcraft, charms, or sorcery, and that she would not swap the royal baby for another child. This fear of the warming pan baby swap was very real. The midwife was the primary witness to the birth. Her integrity had to be beyond question. Despite this suspicion, a good midwife was indispensable. The French royal family had a long tradition of employing skilled accouchesses or female midwives. One of the most famous was Madame du Coudray in the 18th century. She was commissioned by King Louis XV to travel throughout France to teach midwifery to peasant women. She invented a life-sized obstetrical mannequin or machine to demonstrate different birthing scenarios. She was a pioneer of medical education and saved countless lives. The arrival of male doctors into the birthing chamber created a direct conflict with the midwives. Doctors often saw midwives as ignorant and superstitious rivals. They worked to discredit them and push them out of practice, especially among the wealthy and powerful. This was partly a turf war, but it was also a clash of knowledge systems. The doctors had formal university-based learning, while the midwives had informal, experience-based learning. The doctors, being men from the upper classes, usually won the argument. Yet for a laboring queen, the calm, experienced presence of a trusted midwife may have been far more comforting than the interventionist approach of a male doctor. The midwife was a woman. She understood the process from a female perspective, and her skills were honed by practice, not just by theory. But her power was a double-edged sword. She was both a vital caregiver and a potential scapegoat, a figure of both respect and deep-seated fear. Number 5, why was a queen's physical damage a state secret? A royal woman's body was a public vessel, but the long-term consequences of its use were a private shame. The physical trauma of multiple difficult births was a closely guarded secret, conditions that were a common result of childbirth in the pre-modern era, such as uterine prolapse, chronic incontinence from fistula injuries, and severe pelvic damage were never spoken of. A queen was expected to be a picture of health and dignity. The reality of her physical suffering was hidden behind the palace walls. Uterine prolapse, where the uterus descends into the vaginal canal due to weakened pelvic floor muscles, was a common consequence of numerous and difficult labors. It was a painful and debilitating condition, yet a queen suffering from it would have to endure long hours of standing at court ceremonies pretending that nothing was wrong. There was no effective treatment for it beyond pessaries, which were often uncomfortable and crude. The most devastating injury was the obstetric fistula, a tear between the vagina and the bladder or rectum caused by prolonged obstructed labor. This left a woman incontinent. In an age before modern hygiene, this was a catastrophic injury. The constant leakage and odor would make it impossible to participate in public life. A woman with a fistula was often ostracized. For a queen, such an injury would have to be hidden at all costs. It would have meant a life of isolation within the palace, a secret shame managed by her closest ladies in waiting. And Empress Eugenie of France, the wife of Napoleon III, suffered a severe perineal tear during the birth of her only son in 1856. The delivery required the use of forceps, and the recovery was long and painful. It is believed that the injury was so severe that it made further marital relations, and therefore further pregnancies, impossible. This had significant dynastic consequences, as the imperial line was left with only one heir. Her personal suffering became a factor in state politics, but the specific nature of her injury was not public knowledge. The lack of any effective medical treatment meant that women simply had to endure these conditions. The pioneering work on fistula repair was only done in the mid-19th century by doctors like J. Marion Sims in the United States. Before that, the condition was a life sentence. This secrecy was part of a broader culture that viewed the female body and its functions as inherently shameful. While a queen's pregnancy was a public matter, the physical realities of what happened to her body were considered private and unseemly. To admit to such female complaints would have been seen as undignified and would have undermined the regal, almost divine, image of the monarchy. This created a disconnect between the public image of the queen and her private reality. In public, she was the glorious mother of the nation, the symbol of fertility and dynastic strength. In private, she might be a woman in chronic pain, dealing with the lifelong consequences of her service to the state. The silks and velvets of her court dress hid the bandages and the physical damage beneath. The history books record the births of her children, but they are silent on the price her body paid for them. Number 4, did a difficult birth mean the queen was being judged? When Margaret of Austria, Queen of Spain, was in labor with her 8th child in 1611, the birth was extremely difficult. As she suffered, court preachers were brought in to harangue her. They stood by her bedside and told her that her pain was a direct result of her sins, particularly her vanity and love of fine clothes and jewels. Her agonizing labor was not a medical crisis, but a divine tribunal. She died a few days after the birth. This was a common belief. A swift, easy birth was a sign of a virtuous woman. A long, difficult, and painful labor was a sign that the woman was being punished by God. In the highly religious world of the European courts, this belief had terrifying implications for a queen. A difficult labor could be interpreted as a sign that God did not approve of the queen, her husband, or their reign. It was a public manifestation of divine disfavor. This put immense psychological pressure on the laboring woman. Not only was she enduring physical agony, but she was also being judged by her court and by her God. The queen's own conscience could be her worst enemy. She might believe the accusations. In her pain and fear, she might search her own soul for the sin that had caused her suffering. Was it a moment of pride? A disobedient thought? An uncharitable act? The entire process became a spiritual ordeal as much as a physical one. This belief system also affected her medical care. Since the problem was seen as spiritual, the solutions proposed were often spiritual as well. Instead of focusing on practical ways to ease the birth, her attendants might focus on prayer, confession, and repentance. Relics would be brought to the bedside. The queen might be urged to make a vow to a particular saint if she survived. This could have disastrous consequences. It could delay or prevent practical intervention that might have saved her life. It could also lead to outright cruelty, as in the case of Queen Margaret. The impulse was not to comfort the suffering woman, but to correct the sinner. The gender of the baby could also be woven into this narrative of judgment. The birth of a healthy son was a sign of forgiveness and favor. The birth of a daughter, or a stillborn child, was further proof of sin. Anne Boleyn's miscarriage of a male fetus was the final piece of evidence for many that God had judged her and found her wanting. This way of thinking created a no-win situation for a queen. She was expected to be a model of piety and virtue, but the biological lottery of childbirth was unpredictable. A perfectly healthy and pious woman could have a difficult, obstructed labor for purely anatomical reasons. But in a world that saw God's hand in everything, there was no room for such explanations. The pain was her fault. The death of her child was her fault. Her own death was the final, just punishment for her hidden sins. The birthing chamber was not just a room of pain for many women. It was a courtroom where they were both the defendant and the only witness against themselves. Number 3, why were royal heirs so fragile? In 1700, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, died. He was 11 years old and the only surviving child of the future Queen Anne of Great Britain. His death was a personal tragedy for his mother and a national disaster. He was the Protestant hope for the succession. His death led directly to the Act of Settlement in 1701, which passed the throne to the House of Hanover and forever changed the course of British history. Prince William's short life is a stark reminder of a brutal fact. Even if a queen survived childbirth and produced a healthy heir, there was no guarantee that heir would survive to adulthood. Royal children were, in many ways, incredibly vulnerable. The high infant and child mortality rates that plagued the general population did not spare the palace. Royal nurseries were often a scene of tragedy. One major factor was genetics. Centuries of intermarriage between a small pool of European royal families led to a concentration of genetic disorders. The most famous example is the Habsburg jaw, a prominent lower jaw that was a hallmark of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, a result of generations of inbreeding. More serious was the transmission of hemophilia, the royal disease, which was passed down from Queen Victoria to the royal houses of Spain, Germany, and Russia. The royal infants were also uniquely susceptible to certain dangers. While they were protected from the hardships of poverty, their insulated lives could be a disadvantage. They lived in drafty, crowded palaces that were breeding grounds for disease. A visiting courtier could bring in a deadly infection like smallpox or influenza, which would sweep through the royal nursery. Because royal children were so sheltered, they often had no acquired immunity to common childhood illnesses. What might be a mild sickness for a village child could be a fatal illness for a prince. The medical care they received was, as we've seen, often ineffective or harmful. Babies were frequently purged with laxatives or treated with dangerous substances like mercury or antimony for common ailments. And teething was considered a life-threatening process, and dangerous procedures like lancing the gums were common. The practice of swaddling, where an infant was wrapped tightly in cloths from head to toe, was universal for centuries. It was believed to help the limbs grow straight. In reality, it was restrictive and unhygienic. It could contribute to hip problems, and, if too tight, could restrict breathing. The swaddling cloths were often not changed frequently enough, leading to skin rashes and infections. Feeding practices were also a source of danger. If a wet nurse was not available or became ill, infants might be fed pap, a mixture of bread, water, and sometimes beer, or animal milk from an unsterilized horn or vessel. This was a poor substitute for breast milk and a major source of gastrointestinal infections, which caused deadly diarrhea and dehydration. The pressure to protect the heir was immense. A sniffle or a fever in the royal nursery could cause a national panic. But despite the constant attention, the prayers, and the teams of doctors, royal heirs died with heartbreaking frequency. As Louis XIV of France outlived his son, his grandson, and one of his great-grandsons. He was succeeded by another great-grandson, Louis XV. The Spanish king Philip IV saw son after son die in infancy, leaving the succession to his one sickly surviving son, Charles II, whose multiple disabilities were a direct result of Habsburg inbreeding. For a queen, this was the final turn of the screw. After enduring the public spectacle, the pressure for a son, the risk of death, and the pain of a pre-modern birth, her success could be undone at any moment by a fever or an accident. The survival of the dynasty rested on the fragile life of a single child, a life that could be extinguished with terrifying ease. Number 2, what was the final ordeal of a royal funeral? When a queen died in childbirth, the tragedy did not end with her last breath. Her death, like her life and her labor, was a public, ritualized event. The personal grief of her family was secondary to the requirements of state ceremony. The funeral of a queen was a powerful piece of political theater, designed to reinforce the stability of the monarchy, even in a moment of crisis. First, the body of the queen had to be prepared. This was not a private task for grieving family members. It was a formal procedure carried out by high-ranking court officials and ladies in waiting. The body would be embalmed, a gruesome and invasive process. It was then dressed in magnificent robes of state, often the queen's coronation robes, or a specially made gown of cloth of gold or silver. She would be adorned with jewels, a crown placed on her head or by her side. The goal was not to create a peaceful image of rest, but to display the undiminished majesty of the crown. The queen's body would then lie in state, sometimes for weeks. It would be placed on a grand catafalque in a public room of the palace, surrounded by thousands of burning candles. The public, or at least the nobility, would file past to pay their respects. This was a crucial part of the process, a way to publicly confirm the death and manage the transition of power and sentiment. If the baby had also died, its tiny body would often be part of the ceremony. The infant might be placed in the arms of its mother in the coffin, a heartbreaking tableau of dynastic failure. Or it would have its own smaller coffin placed beside hers. The funeral was a public acknowledgement of the dual loss of the queen and the future of the dynasty she had failed to secure. The funeral procession itself was a massive spectacle. The queen's coffin would be carried on an elaborate funeral carriage, draped in black velvet and pulled by black horses. A long procession of mourners, all dressed in black according to strict rules of court etiquette, would follow. The streets would be lined with silent crowds. The sheer scale and solemnity of the event were designed to impress upon the populace the gravity of the loss and the enduring power of the institution she represented. The religious service would be long and elaborate, filled with sermons that often praised the queen for her piety and for dying in the performance of her sacred duty. Her death was framed as a noble sacrifice for the good of the kingdom. This narrative helped to contain the political damage of a dynastic crisis, turning a failure of the body into a story of martyrdom. For the grieving king, there was no time for private sorrow. He was the center of the funeral rituals. He had to play his part as the chief mourner, the symbol of the grieving nation. And almost immediately, his counselors would begin the delicate business of finding him a new wife. A king could not remain unmarried for long. The need for an heir was too urgent. The search for a new royal bride would often begin before the first one was even buried. The funeral of Jane Seymour, Henry VI's third wife, is a prime example. She died just 12 days after giving birth to the future Edward VI, and Henry was said to be genuinely grief-stricken. He ordered a magnificent funeral for her, and she was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. But despite his grief, the business of state continued. Negotiations for his fourth marriage began shortly thereafter. The queen was dead. The system required a new one. The cycle had to begin again. The grand funeral was the final, public act in a life that was never truly her own. Number 1, was a queen's body ever her own? A peasant woman's body might belong to her husband. A noble woman's body was a key to her family's fortune. But a queen's body belonged to the state. From the moment she was born, and certainly from the moment she was betrothed, her physical self was a national asset, a political tool, and a public symbol. She had almost no autonomy over it. Her life was a performance of biological duty, and the stage was the entire kingdom. Her virginity before marriage was not a matter of personal morality, but of state security. It had to be proven and certified to ensure the legitimacy of her future children. Any hint of scandal could ruin a marriage alliance and insult a nation. Her body was examined and discussed by ambassadors and physicians. Once married, her menstrual cycle became a matter of public record. The court watched for signs of pregnancy with an obsessive focus. A missed period was a cause for national celebration. The state of her womb was a topic of diplomatic correspondence. Her pregnancy was a public condition. Her diet, her exercise, and her daily routine were all prescribed and monitored. She was surrounded by attendants who were as much guards as they were servants, there to ensure she did nothing to endanger the precious royal fetus. Her childbirth was a public spectacle, as we have seen. Her most intimate, painful, and vulnerable moments were witnessed by a crowd of officials. Her body was the site of a crucial state event, and privacy was not an option. After the birth, her body was expected to recover quickly and prepare for the next pregnancy. She was not allowed to breastfeed, as this would delay conception. Her reproductive capacity was a national resource that had to be maximized. The physical toll of this constant childbearing, the exhaustion, the chronic pain, the permanent injuries, was a sacrifice she was expected to make without complaint. Even her appearance was not her own. She was expected to embody the ideals of royalty. Her clothes, her hair, and her posture were all part of the political image of the dynasty. A queen who gained too much weight or who did not look sufficiently regal could be criticized for failing in her symbolic duty. In the end, even in death, her body was not hers. It was an object of state ceremony, embalmed, dressed, and displayed to serve a final political purpose. This complete lack of bodily autonomy is perhaps the harshest reality of all. A queen had wealth, status, and privilege. She lived in a palace and was surrounded by luxury, but she lacked the most basic freedom, the right to control her own body. Her life was defined by a single biological function. She was a vessel for the bloodline, an instrument for securing the succession. The silks and jewels were the gilded trappings of a cage. The history books remember these women as queens, consorts, and mothers of kings. But they were also captives of their own biology, their bodies pledged to the crown from the cradle to the grave.